So good morning, everyone. I would like to show a little bit different perspective to what have been shown before. I'm trying to use different examples from different parts of the world in our research lab related to use modeling approaches rather than predict presence of species. We will talk a lot about risk of invasion in places. So here is a map with the case studies that I will show today. We will focus on probably in Patagonia and South America and also in Pacific Northwest, but also we have working in Pakistan and also in Africa, in Gabon. So habitat models are really useful surrogate of species distributions and have been used widely and in ecology, especially in terrestrial systems. And most recently, aquatic ecosystems have been also been shown that this model could be really useful for management and predictions. And it's the basics of these models are basically they can predict the probability of occurrence of species. Because the habitat configuration may act as environmental resistance, and means that species may be adapted to use those habitat or not. We can use this idea in related to inversely related to risk. So less resistant of the landscape to an invasion will be more risk of invasion and vice versa. So this is ideas, and we know that climate change and other disturbances from previous speakers show that climate change will change the habitat composition of these areas, in this case landscape. These disturbances will be modified the resistant or the previous resistant of the landscape, and then they can affect the success of species, novel species and new species that will be introduced. So we will focus on those species that have been introduced for a long time, but also in new introductions in this talk. And here's one example that we use in Gabon, in Africa, in an area with a really data deficient area. We don't have much information about the species. And we use a collection of fishes from different surveys from different scientists. And we create these Maxen model, which is a maximum entropy model. Basically, they are based on occurrences of species in different places. And then we model the surrounding landscape and see how those models can predict the probability of occurrences. And in this case, they were developing of dams in these areas, and new dams you see in the shaded areas, and the potential loss of habitat, in this case, not the species, but also we talk about marine traits of those species. So all this habitat will be lost. So again, these models seem to be really useful for large scales planning and resources. In the case of rivers, they are really important or really interesting to use this model because in complex terrain, channel configuration and surrounding landscape will shape this river habitat. So if we know fine scale conditions of local habitat and we extrapolate this for larger landscape, we can have an idea about how different pieces of the river will be suitable for some species that are being introduced or even native species. So we use this idea about the risk of reproductive and early success introducing of salmon in Patagonia. Salmon in Patagonia have been introduced since the 1800s, and some species have been successful, but because of the aquaculture activity, more species have been introduced so far. This work is being conducted by my PhD student Andres Olivo from Chile. And I will explain a little bit the modality of this model, and then the other example will use something similar to this. Basically, we use digital elevation models in order to predict hydrological conditions. We also use climate models and different, landscape downscaling model we can use too, and gauging data from existing gauge. We use USGS, but in other places we have less density of gauges. We can use whatever is available. And then we model the flow, because when we model flow, we can delineate the network of rivers in different cases. And then we can go a fine scale, and we have a rich characterization, and we can use different scales of rich characterization. On the other side, we know habitat relationship between different attributes for this rich characterization. In this case, this is an example of two species that are native from the Pacific Northwest, but they are invasive in other places. In this case, Patagonia, we use coho salmon and Chinook salmon. Different species have different requirements, so we use this as an advantage to see what species will be more successful in one place than others. And we know this information from literature review and also for consult to experts. Then we know the estimation of the local habitat potential based on these relationships, so we can characterize individual reaches at different scales. And then we can use the network connectivity analysis in GIS. We use a habitat complementation because some habitats are good for reproduction, but others are good for rearing. So we need to find the two in order to predict which species will be successful in reproduce and then in rearing, right? Here is the connection with the climate change or other human disturbances, because we can add this to the landscape. We can use model protection to see how those habitats will change in the future. We can use land use changes, we can use dams, and in this case, in what we did in Gabon, or we can use road, culvert, whatever is the attribute that will change in the landscape. And then we can map the distribution of salmon habitat, in this case, with low potential, medium potential, or high potential to be used. Then we can use these projections and the climate projection, habitat change, in order to see how much of this habitat will be lost in the future. This is the main idea of these models, and they have different tweaks in this case, but in this, the general idea, you use the landscape, you get the attribute, you use the climate, and you use the species relationship with those habitats, and then you create this modeling that can predict differential success of the species. So we use this same idea and we expand in the case when two salmonids are present in the Pacific Northwest. And Jen was talking about the hybridization risk. Most of those studies have been conducted in really specific areas. And we would like to have a map in the bull trout habitat where those hybridization may occur. And we're talking about bull trout, that's ESA listed species, and introduced trout from the East Coast, which is brook trout, and they can produce hybrids. So it's a really high risk for the native species. And this is a work being conducted by Mike Manning and will be probably soon ready for submission. So basically what we do is we see the overlap, this habitat between natives and introduced species, and we can use a different, in this case, hydrological unit levels. We can decide how confident we're in different places, and we see the habitat overlap between the two species. Then we create this idea using an idea from risk management related to the probability of overlap between the two spawning habitats for the two species in cases where the introduced species is present, in case of the introduced species is absent, but could be present in the future. So we can create this risk maps analysis at different levels. And Mike did this for Oregon. And you see, basically, we can have really nice map that could be used for management related to where those hybridization risk areas may occur. So we can basically localize resources related to those areas. And we can also see what tool we can use in order to minimize that. So now jumping to an extrapolation of this model is basically trying to find in other places where really data deficient areas. In the case, rainbow trout is invaded the Indus River in Pakistan. And this is a huge watershed, one of the most important in Asia. And Arif Jan is a PhD student from Pakistan in my lab working in these ideas and trying to expand this habitat model to a niche model. We can use climate variables and the presence of other species too in this kind of the similar idea. And he just starting to create this suitable habitat for rainbow trout that will be really important because rainbow trout compete with native fishes in Pakistan, in this case, cyclic names snow trout, but also is really, rainbow trout is really desirable for recreational fisheries. So managers can use these type of maps in order to use where introduce rainbow trout for recreational fisheries and where avoid the success of rainbow trout in cases when they overlap with native fishes. So in the US, we have new tools and we have more data, and even we can validate this model using probably people will know about this, environmental DNA. eDNA is basically we take a cup of water and we can see the species and we can create, for example, maps where the end of fish distributions occur in the landscape. This is a work we did published this year, and we went to private lands and federal lands and trying to find where the end of fish occur. And this is really important for management because the forest practices changes depending who is the landowner, for example, or where a fish are present or absent. So we basically conducted this idea, we compared with traditional electrofishing, and we found that this method of eDNA is really, really sensitive to presence of trout. And you can see here in this figure that in this case, coastal cutthroat trout, only with a few number of species in the river is easily detectable using DNA. In some cases, eDNA could be even more sensitive to traditional electrofishing. So if we can use this idea of eDNA to validate this model, will be really great, the tool in order to find fine-tuning species in early onset of invasions. And we did this in this case with an in situ eDNA sample that is available now in the technology. The technology is advancing so fast. We have this biomine unit that you can go with your iPhone, put the samples, put the reactive, and you can have in an hour a result if the species is present or absent. And we tested this with Jake Ponce and Mastering Natural Resources in Washington, in different places with invasive New Zealand mud snail, and we were able to detect present and absent, in this case, a species that is really patchy distributed. And you can see these boxes are representing abundances, relative abundances of mud snail in the same river. You see each line in one river in different places. So in some cases, you need to tweak this method in order to see the species that are more patchy. You may need to sample along different lines, different sections, in order to make sure that the species is present. And you can see in the last two lines, basically the idea of patchy distribution. So now we have this technology of linking eDNA with a habitat model. We are just working on this idea of using multi-season occupancy model in order to see when two species, one invasive, one native, in presence with eDNA and trapping and temperature models. Also at the landscape level, we can try to evaluate the interaction between native species, in this case, Anko chub and invasive smallmouth bass. And this is a work that will be conducted, and we have all the samples that we're just working in the result and the modeling now, and we can have entire watersheds map with the overlap between species and the potential interaction and driven by, for example, temperature sensor that we have an array of temperature sensor during the landscape. I will show an example that use all this information for management tool and for risk management, basically. And this is related to multifaceted risk analysis of environmental impact from salmon farming in South America. We're talking about a landscape with more than 100,500 kilometers of coast. And this is a production of 1 in million of ton of salmon every year. And that's a revenue about 4.5 million. And the problem in the salmon farming is these are the areas where in southern Chile where those salmon farming are distributed. There are different salmon species being cultivated, including Atlantic salmon from the Europe and the east coast of the US and North America, coho salmon from the Pacific coast, rainbow trout from the Pacific coast too. So we have an assemblage of species from different origins, all concentrated in net pans in marine systems. These are the productions, and in different areas we have a differentiate production there. And you can see this an example of a farm. And these farm, each of them can hold up to between 2,000 and 6,000 tons every year. Just to give an example of this is like the basic risk of this activity, salmon farm, is basically the escapes. And the escape can happen for different reasons. Could be related to weather conditions, right? And side, for example, the anchors of the site at the bottom, maybe bad calculated. We can have thieves, we have predation from sea lions, we have accidents, and we have also lack of management, right? Or poor management. Just to give you an idea about the magnitude of the production in 2018, a single huge scape includes more than 680,000 Atlantic salmon escape in one farm. And just to give a comparison with what is in the Pacific Northwest, almost more than half of the entire return of the Columbia River happened in one single escape. So this is a huge problem in southern Chile for the rates of escape. So we are thinking about this as a risk, and a risk we have three components. We have hazard, sensitivity, and exposure. Hazard is related to the external pressure that will cause the impact, in this case, the escapes or the production. We have characteristic of the receiving ecosystems that will increase. Age is basically the presence or absence of predators, for example, or fishers. And E is the exposure, is what can be lost in areas with sensitive native species or highly biodiverse or endemisms. And this is the idea. We create this matrix of different areas of different levels of information. In the case of hazard, we have the number of fish that being stocked every year, the number of escape, the trophic position of different salmoniid species, the potential survival outside when they escape, and the reproductive capacity of them. And when they can be highly likely to reproduce, this is a long term, right? Because the species will be successfully established, and its short term will be those that escape, but they cannot survive. So we have this short term and long term, and we can create different type of scores based on the information that we have in each places. We have, for example, endangered species in the green area. We have areas of reproduction for native coastal fishes, for example, and we create this metric of exposure, sensitivity, and hazard, different scores, and then we create a matrix of risk. And as a final product, you can see areas of long-term sensitivity in the case of Atlantic salmon, a species that have not been reproduced or been successfully reproduced yet. And we can have this area of high or low risk. And we can create this map for areas, but most importantly, for long-term risk, for example, we can create these scores of risk for each region in this case. And this will be really useful for managers in order to know, with in some cases uncertainties or high uncertainty in some of the score, we can revise this score every time with more information being available. We're trying to use these. This is similar than being done for the IPCC method. And basically, as a final take-home message is basically these models can be used in different regions with different level of knowledge about species and ecosystems. And this model require validation in the field, but can be transferable across regions too. This multifaceted risk model based on hazard, sensitivity, and exposure can incorporate the habitat distribution model too. And also this can an opportunity for participation, because the knowledge about invasive species, when you ignore human dimension, is all usually fail. We need to incorporate humans in the management, in the prevention, and the control of invasive species. And with that, I think I'm happy to answer any question later. This is again talking about different countries, different fund sources. It's really difficult when trying to merge all these to have a cohesive story for today. Thank you very much.